All right, fantastic. So again, I apologize for the delay. This is schematics for Tuesday night. We have a good crowd here, and then I'm assuming a good crowd online. As you all might have heard, I've just minimized all of you. So thank you all so much for being here, and it means a lot to me that all of you are here. This is a book that's very important to me, and I think that I've broken our rules just a little bit because I've brought two books tonight that I'd like to share with everyone, and I think that we will be well served with the time that we spend with them. I do hope that we have time for a little bit of discussion. I have two discussion questions at the end, and once you get to the content of both of these books, I do think it would be productive if we could spend some time on that. So even more so than just the discussion we have about the text, I think that it'll be productive for us to delve into that a little bit together. And even if we don't disagree with each other, I think just the act of working through, even if we agree why it is we agree, would be really productive and some time well spent together. I'm not sure if we usually keep the Zoom meeting up for the full discussion, but whatever is the standard procedure, I think would be great. So tonight is Witness, and it is written by Whittaker Chambers. It is an autobiography and is published in 1952. The first thing that we're going to notice is that it is a big book, and I'll just dramatic effect if you hear that. It is very large, clocking in at well over 700 pages, approaching 800. It is a large book. So my gargantuan task tonight is trying to convince everyone why you should commit the time to read Mr. Chambers's autobiography, political treatise, and his work here, Witness. So Whittaker Chambers might be a name that we are a little bit familiar with, but just a little bit. And if you are a high school student in an AP US history class, you might notice his name. You might notice more the name of his opponent here, Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers are the two individuals, and their conflict is going to determine the story that we have tonight, and why they're important and what they believe is, again, going to determine much of our conversation. So Whittaker Chambers is a fascinating individual. Born at the very beginning of the 20th century, he lived through a number of fascinating events, but early on in his life, he became very politically active. He became very philosophical, and he was a man who was gifted with writing and gifted in terms of speech. And during the course of his early life, unfortunately, he had a number of family struggles, and he had a very particular way of viewing the world, which unfortunately, in his own view, would lead him to join the Communist Party. We'll get into all of that in just a little bit. We'll get into why he tried to change the world, why he tried to view the world in this very specific way, and what it meant at that time to join the Communist Party. But more than just join the Communist Party, he eventually would become a communist spy. Again, at this time, the late 1930s, early 1940s, we were not yet in the Cold War. The United States was not yet competing with the Soviet Union directly, and so it was a different time in our international cooperation and competition with the Soviet Union, who, if you recall, historically were our allies back and forth in the Second World War. So again, a difficult relationship and a difficult time. Again, Whittaker Chambers, first an open communist, then a communist spy. He did pass on sensitive documents and information to the Soviet Union, but very importantly, would later break with the communist movement and with communism in general. He gave a full accounting of his actions to the FBI after he broke, and we'll get into why he did that and what that looked like just a little bit later. But following that, no action was taken for a number of years. He lived a quiet life on his farm and moved forward as an editor of Time magazine. He was fairly prominent later in conservative circles, so on the opposite end of the political spectrum, as a conservative commentator and a critic of Alger Hiss, notably Hiss's participation in the Yalta Conference. So if we again remember World War II and the actions that were occurring at the end of the Second World War, the Yalta Conference was the process by which the victorious Allies would divvy up the world. And so if you remember the maps toward the end of the 20th century, the Soviet Union ended up governing half of Europe, and the Free West governed the other half. Alger Hiss is the individual who we are preoccupied with for just a few minutes now. He was an earlier friend of Whittaker Chambers, an acquaintance. They lived together for a time. The Hisses and his family rented out rooms to Whittaker Chambers and his family, and crucially, they were spies together. This would be the conflict that is the pivotal point of Witness. Whittaker Chambers, during his deposition and during his testimony to the FBI, left out a number of crucial facts. He was seeking to protect his former friends, and he was seeking to minimize the damage to their lives because they had not come to the same decision that he was at during that time. And so he did not name the other spies. He gave his own name and he told his own truth, but he did not inform on his fellow friends. So again, at this time in the 1940s, we're still spying on the United States actively. During the course of the FBI's later investigation towards 1950, Alger Hiss's name came up, other details reactivated in a way, Whittaker Chambers' testimony, and all of a sudden what was private became very public. We don't know the name Alger Hiss today. He doesn't really mean a lot. Again, he's been dead for 20 years now. He outlived Whittaker Chambers by quite a bit. But at the time, he was a very important individual. We mentioned the Yalta Conference, excuse me, and Alger Hiss was one of the key architects of that and one of the architects of the early importance of the State Department. And we'll get into what that looked like again in just a little bit. But again, Alger Hiss is important because he was so very prominent and he was a very respected individual who at this time had not broken with communism, was still actively a communist spy. So we have two individuals. And again, maybe we can change this around and make it more applicable to us. If you imagine modern day names. So if you think of a modern day conservative writer, someone on the right, if we say Kevin Williamson from National Review, went forward and was called before Congress and he said, yes, it's true. I was a spy for communist China. And what's more, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was also a spy with me for communist China. They would be an uproar. People would be very much upset about this because it would be seen as just a partisan move. You're a conservative and this person is a progressive. They're doing very well for themselves and you're just kind of off on the periphery. And now you are trying to tear them down. And so again, that is the conflict here between Whittaker Chambers, who is a repentant communist spy, and Alger Hiss, who is not. So as we go through this book, again, I'm trying to do my best tonight to convince everyone that they should listen to the arguments, which are now 70 years old. Again, this book first published in 1952. So what impact does it still have on us? Secondly, this sounds like a very political argument, a very politicized group of individuals making political actions. Why should this matter? Now, 70 years out of date. The things that they stood for, are they still impacting the world around us today? How so, how not? So let's look into that. What lessons of the 20th century are still with us? What can we draw out of Witness, and what can we draw out of Whittaker Chambers' life? There are a number of things that I want to draw out of tonight. First of all, we'll clarify Whittaker Chambers' story. I know that was a big info dump here at the beginning of the lesson. We have a couple of slides that'll break down his actions, why he did what he did, and who he was around. And hopefully his story will make some sense to us by the end of today's talk, but that's not really what's important. There are two key aspects that I really want to draw out of Witness and I think speak to the world today, and specifically to Christians who are seeking to involve themselves in political matters, what that can look like. How can that be constructive? How can that be destructive? And then what is politics? What makes individuals want to dedicate their lives to these sort of systems? Why do they do that? And what are we doing whenever we dedicate our lives to a much larger system, to the church? Is that a political action? What does that all look like? So hopefully their worldviews will become clearer. Both the views of Alger Hiss and his compatriots and Whittaker Chambers and the men who supported him will become clear, in our own worldview can kind of contrast with theirs. So again, during the course of this, again, there'll be a lot of information very specific to his story and the actions that he undertook. If you have questions that would clarify why he did what he did, I know it's easier to ask in person than maybe it is online, but if you do have questions, please do feel free to ask. We should have a little bit of time in order to go through who Whittaker Chambers was, why he did what he did, and if the timeline again gets confusing, we will be glad to clarify that just a little bit. A quote here just to close the intro section. André Malraux is a French politician, contemporary of Whittaker Chambers. Whenever this book was published, he wrote him a letter and he said, "You did not come back from hell with empty hands." Whittaker Chambers, again, had to flee the Communist Party, had to hide underground. He had to live in fear for his own safety and the safety of his family for a number of years. He suffered quite a bit because of his decision to break with the communist underground. And here we have an individual who has just a very powerful quote that says, "You suffered all of this for a reason." So hopefully we'll see why he did what he did and see if it still bears weight for us today. If I can move to the next slide. Maybe. Ah, there we go. Okay, so these are the individuals that we're going to be looking at. First, on the left, this is just a bit of historical background. About the time that all of this is happening is the time when the communist world is undergoing quite a bit of tumult among themselves. The second book that we're getting into, Darkness at Noon, deals specifically with the Stalinist purges, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. That's a very dark time in their history and in world history, as it were. Again, on the far left, we have Joseph Stalin and Joachim von Ribbentrop. You probably know his name from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Again, during the opening phases of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were actually allies and helped each other out quite a bit, specifically during the invasion of Poland, where they divvied up Poland among themselves. Again, very dark time in history, and the individuals that we would later be allied with in the Soviet Union begun the war working with Nazi Germany. Not so much to bring that up tonight because it has too much bearing tonight, but again, these people are trying to act their own political views and make the world around them follow that. We have here the two individuals. Whittaker Chambers is in the top, I don't know if I'm pointing, the top right, and then Alger Hiss is beneath him. Again, Alger Hiss is the younger man at that point and is with the State Department. Whittaker Chambers is not. He is working with Time magazine at that time. So, because I think it's important to hear their voices and to have their arguments heard in their own voices for just a little bit, and to realize that these are real people, not just finger puppets for us to point around at tonight, I'd like to play this clip. Please let me know if the sound comes through on the video.
Alger Hiss, former high state departmental official, is branded a communist spy by an American jury after a sensational trial.
That's all good.
It began 18 months ago when his accuser, Whittaker Chambers, self-confessed former communist, testified before the Un-American Affairs Committee.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity.
On oath, contradicts the evidence of Chambers on almost every point. The 45-year-old Harvard-educated American names 34 prominent people whose confidence he enjoyed. They include Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, State Secretaries Burns and Atchison. Says he,
ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor. Then the committee can judge and the public can judge whether to believe a self-discredited accuser whose names and aliases are as numerous and as casual as his accusation. The undocumented statements of the man who now calls himself Whittaker Chambers. Is he a man of consistent reliability, truthfulness, and honor? Clearly not. He admits it and the committee knows it.
at the first trial, the jury disagreed. At the second, it found Hiss guilty of perjury, a communist spy.
All right, perfect. And I'll switch back over to our presentation. So as the video shared there, Hiss was found guilty of perjury. He went too far in his defense and tried to claim that he had never even met Whittaker Chambers and was proven wrong. So again, was jailed for perjury for a time. The opinion was still sharply divided at the end of the case. And so the motivation for Whittaker Chambers to write this book was to sit down and say, I had limited time in order to present myself and why I did what I did. And so in order to set the record straight and show who I am, I'm going to lay it all out. And again, he did in 800 pages, really show us his whole life, why he did what he did and what his motivations were. So again, this story is very dramatic. It makes a very dramatic book. This is both an autobiography, a political treatise, as I said, and a spy novel. It's a very interesting read. There are parts of it that can get a little drudgy, especially if you are not really politically minded yourself and don't have a lot of patience for that sort of thing. But all throughout the book, there are little nuggets of action and intrigue. And again, he is active as a spy for the bulk of the novel. Now, he is the least James Bond individual ever in existence. And as you can see from his picture and from the video we just watched, kind of a portly man. And so again, there's no car chases, there's no gunfights. He is mostly making photocopies of documents at his home, but there is always danger. There more than one time his life is directly threatened. Numerous times people make veiled threats that he will be killed for his actions. So again, an interesting book. And if that's simply the reason to flip through it, I think it's worth your time. It's an interesting Cold War thriller in its own right and a true story. again, written primarily to settle the facts surrounding this case. We won't go too much back into his case. We'll get into the facts surrounding his spying in just a little bit. But again, that's really secondary to his arguments. With schematics, what we're looking at is worldviews. And so I want to dig into the worldview of Whittaker Chambers. First, what prompted him to become a communist spy? Why did he betray his country and sell out or support the actions of an opposing government on the other side of the world? Why did he feel a kinship with them that he did not feel with the United States government? And then secondly, what brought him back? Why did he say, I cannot follow this path any longer. I have to come back and I have to be an American citizen. And moreover, I am fanatically opposed now to the communist government, communist ideals. I don't think that this is primarily even about communism. That was Chambers's life, and that was what he was seeking to prove and disprove throughout his actions. But I think if we look at why he did what he did, just the questions he had to ask himself and the actions that he went through mean quite a bit to us wherever we are. So this book, it's tempting just to put it in a box and say, this is the 1950s. It was the Red Scare. We were in a different time and a different place. The lessons are no longer applicable. I think that, and I hope that we can prove tonight that that is simply not the case. The first question we have, why involve yourself in this at all? Whenever you bring up politics, I think a lot of people are tempted to shrug their shoulders and harumph and say, that's so divisive. I don't like this. This is something that people argue about. Nothing ever gets solved. How can you live this way? And all of that is very true. Again, we just talked through a man's life who was destroyed and then rebuilt and then destroyed again by his political convictions. It'd be so much easier to avoid all of that and just stay out of it. So should we, either, depending on how you view it, bury your head in the sand and ignore it all? Turn off the news, turn off the TV, don't listen to political commentary, don't form political opinions, let it happen. What happens, happens, and that's the world around us, and we're called to be separate. Or is there a different way? Are we supposed to be involved? Do we need to be involved as American citizens? We have the right to vote. We have the right to be involved in our government, to run for office. Is that something we should do? Or is there a middle ground between the two? I think that that's a very individualistic question, and we'll get into the idea of individualism as we go forward. But is there a right answer for those of us in the church? Is there something that we can arrive at that says, maybe this is the path we should be following? Or in our individual lives, can we live this out even without political action? You don't have to put a sign in your front yard and you put a bumper sticker on your car to live in this way. Having an educated, philosophically driven life is part of who we are as Christians. And so again, we're trying to prove that here shortly. I did want to use this quote. I brought this up in my class on Wednesday. If anyone was with me last Wednesday for our Gnosticism class at Fishing Grove Church of Christ, we have a quote here from Jay Nordlinger. He is a writer with National Review Online, and he was interviewing a Cuban-American woman who was speaking during the recent Cuban protests, and she was describing her country and what it was like to live in communist Cuba. And again, don't tie this just to communism. Look at countries all over the world that are under authoritarian governments who are have fallen under the sway of a strongman or under a military junta or any sort of things. Things fall apart very quickly. And what does it look like when society falls apart? This woman says it takes a martyr-level courage to live as a decent human being in Cuba, not to lie, not to steal, not to spy, not to inform, not to cheat, not to sell your body, not to buy somebody else's. You have no idea. And again, think about the misery it would take to say that about your home, that's where someplace you should be proud of, someplace you should be happy to live. And you're saying that about your friends, your family, your neighbors, that they have two options in front of them. They either have to live as heroes with heroic level strength, or liars, cheaters, thieves, prostitutes, people who buy the services of prostitutes. What sort of world is that? And then how much more difficult is it to be a Christian in that sort of world? Well, who has time for philosophy in that sort of world? Who has time to hammer out their own beliefs when survival becomes your only option? There's another quote that I wanted to examine here. This is Paul Rehe. He wrote a book on the Attic War. And the Attic War is the Spartan word for the Peloponnesian War. And no one needs to know anything about that tonight, except that he was in an interview and somebody brought up, you wrote a book on a very specific topic, on a war that was fought 2,500 years ago. why on earth should anyone care about this? And why do people read books like this anyway? And his answer was, war does not care if you're interested in it. It is interested in you. In the same way with all political actions, there is an extent to which you can run, you can hide, you can choose where you live, try to live in a peaceable place. And there are individuals who withdraw from the world of politics entirely. And if you do that as a philosophical decision, I think that that's very respectful. If you do it just because you enjoy ignorance, I think that's something else entirely. But if you notice the picture here, I don't know how well we can see that online, but that is the church parsonage of the Gettysburg Methodist Church. And if you'll notice right by the window there, there's a 12-pound Confederate shell that's still embedded in that building. At a certain point, reality closes in. You cannot just simply will it away. You cannot simply act as if nothing will happen. Things happen. Something will happen to you today, tomorrow, the day after. And again, especially in a country like this, a democracy, we have the ability to construct that. So again, my argument tonight is that this is something we should be involved with. And again, not that the country's going to fall apart into this Cuban style lifestyle that we have here, but again, do we see parts of that creeping in? Does it get a little bit harder to be a Christian depending on how we live and how we interact with each other? The first part tonight, we're going to go through very quickly, the Ware Group. This is Whittaker Chambers' spy group. We're going to recount his story just a little bit, go over, try to soften up some of the edges from where I ran through his story just a few seconds ago. Again, if we do have any questions about the historical aspect, this would be a good time to ask them once we're closed up here. Again, we won't dwell on this too much. This is just to give you some background on him and who he was, but we won't be dwelling on this because this is not his entire argument. Now, whenever Chambers was writing the book, this was his big argument to prove that I was a spy, I was telling the truth, and now I'm telling the truth again that Alger Hiss was a spy with me. For us today, that's secondary importance, but we'll go through it very quickly. So Chambers, again, was born at the beginning of the 20th century, and his work is fascinating because he shows what early 20th century America was really like. I thought it was a little funny because he is very taken with his hometown and his adopted hometown, I should say, of Baltimore, Maryland, and he waxes philosophical about how beautiful Baltimore is and how clean and great it is and how much ingenuity is in Baltimore. And I mean, no disrespect if anyone is from Baltimore or is working or living there today, but it's kind of has a reputation as a rougher city these days. And so it's just a different time and a different place. But again, Whittaker Chambers gives us a look at early 20th century America. And if that's all you're interested in, it is still worth the read very much. Now, again, he does also highlight the lives of several other individuals and other communists, both in his circle and historical communists who he never met, but he read their works. And I think it's very important that he is not angry at them. He does not hate them, even after he has broken with the Communist Party. He shows us that he wants to learn from them. And for the extent that they did what they thought was right, he still thinks that that's an honorable thing to do, even if he really disagreed with them, which I thought was interesting and shows you the kind of man that he is. And again, we'll deal with the kind of man that he is in just a little bit. Finally, his individualism, the ability of the individual to choose, is a really big turning point in the novel. He no longer is subjecting himself to the communist system and no longer subjecting himself to their wishes. He flees partially in order to preserve his own life, because at that point his life is being directly threatened and a number of his friends have disappeared. And we'll get into that and sadly what that means in just a little bit. But what is individualism? And so as we move through the lesson, if we could think about what that means for us as Christians. Are we truly individuals? We are supposed to die as self and live in Christ. So the Jordan, the you, the all of us that could have been, that would have been, if not for Christ, is no longer in existence. We are something else entirely. So how do we reconcile that with our political, social, cultural lives and with who we are day by day? This is the individual who founded the spy group. He is an interesting individual in his own right, Harold Ware. He was born before the 20th century and the 19th century and lived until 1935. He had a reputation for driving very fast, which in 1935, I wonder what driving very fast looked like, but apparently he was known for it, and he got in a car crash and died. And that was the beginning of the end of his spy group. But while he was active, they had a very unique position within the Communist Party, and within the United States government. So he was a very gifted farmer. He understood farming, he understood agriculture and the agricultural lifestyle. And notably, during the Great Depression especially, he was very sympathetic to Southern tenant farmers. And if you know anything about the Depression, if you know anything about what those people had to endure, that is a good thing, that he was sympathetic to them and that he viewed them as people who needed help. But ultimately, he wanted something very radical for them. If you know anything about the Soviet Union and how the communist governments worked, the idea of a communist government is called a Soviet. It is a portion of a country or a whole country that is ruled by the Communist Party. No other political actions are allowed. The party controls everything, and it becomes part of this greater whole. So, for example, most of us would be familiar with maps from the second half of the 20th century that show the Soviet Union. And again, the countries that used to be there are no longer there. There was no longer a Ukraine for a time. Poland was gone. So many countries in Eastern Europe had just disappeared, and it became the Soviet. So Harold Ware's idea was that the poor Southern farmers should have an uprising, make their own Soviet, and then kind of donate their land and themselves to the Soviet Union to join them. And now that's a very far-fetched idea, and there's no evidence that he was even remotely close to making anything like that happen, but that was his long shot goal. In the meantime, he came up with the idea that I should support the Soviet Union. And part of the way that that happened was with Alexander Ulanovsky. Now, Ulanovsky was a Soviet spy recruiter. His job was to go around the world and to kind of collect individuals who were favorably disposed towards the Soviet Union and bring them into the fold. Now, very interesting, I don't know if you can read the tiny text there. This individual, Alexander, was with Stalin, and we'll get into Stalin and what his politics mean for this whole group in just a little bit, but he was with Stalin in exile. They had shared exile together. They had spoken whenever they were young men. They knew each other. That would not save him from the Gulag system. And we'll get into what the Gulags were and what the purges were in just a little bit, but even interesting that this man would be part of that as well. But Alexander sets up the Ware Group. These are the individuals who would be spying for the Soviet Union. Every one of them was recruited because they were favorably disposed towards communism, and they really truly believed in helping to further the mission of the Soviet Union. We'll get into what that means in just a little bit. Mostly their job was, again, not so much exciting, not so much any James Bond action, but they were to take documents from here. We have the list, the State Department, the Aberdeen Proving Ground. It's still active, I believe. It's United States Army testing base, obviously very high level stuff going on there. Most notably, this group did steal plans for a bomb site. So if you're in a bomber flying over a city, you would need to look through a glass and see where your bombs are going to land. The United States had, in the years before World War II, a very advanced bomb site, and it was taken by the Soviet Union because of this group. Also, the Department of Navy, and again, the Department of Agriculture was where Ware himself was stationed. So these individuals would take documents home and say, I'm going to work on this at home. They would photograph it, return the original document, and the copy would go to the Soviets. Now, again, that sounds very boring, and it is. For several pages, you'll read this, I'm copying documents, and it's not exactly a page turner. But what makes it very scary is that these individuals are answering to the Soviet Union whenever they're going through a very scary time in their own history. So during the purges, during the suppression of Soviet dissidents, these individuals, half the world away, are caught up in this disagreement, and we'll get into what that means in just a second. With the background, we will get into, again, why this became a dangerous time. The three things that I want to break down here, again, not that this book is totally about communism. I think the ideas that we're going to pull out tonight very much apply everywhere else. But Chambers was very much taken with the conflict between the West and communism, and that was his life. So again, we'll need to make sure we know a couple things. The three things I have in the first bullet point, if we can see that, the Soviet and the communist ideas here, the Great Revolution, the class system, and then finally, again, the Soviet system, the United Soviet Socialist Republic is what USSR stands for. So in terms of what motivates these communists, these people on the other side of the world who have given up their countries and have joined together to make something else, and something that very quickly became terrifying. The Great Revolution is an idea of Karl Marx, and Marx is, again, the person who really set the system of communism in motion and organized it all together under one name. His idea of the Great Revolution is that, again, there are the people who work and produce things, and there are the rich people who consume things. These people are always at odds. They can never be friends. They can never work together. Anytime they interact, the rich are going to take advantage of the poor. And that's an incredibly simplistic way of looking at it, but it is neither in our time nor interest to dwell on that too much today. But the idea of the Great Revolution is what excited so much attachment to the Soviet Union in the 20th century, because again, this is an abstract ideal. And then after the Russian Revolution and the formation of the Soviet Union, individuals think that this philosophical ideal is becoming real in front of them, which is again, why they were so motivated to help out the Soviet Union. The thing that they had read about in books and thought about as a distant possibility, they believed it was happening in front of them. Now, what makes Stalin so pivotably important, and we'll just spend half a second dwelling on him, is that he said, we have to stop. The revolution cannot go on. We cannot take over every other country in the world. We cannot dominate the world. We have to hold what we have. We have to rule it with an iron fist, prevent any dissidents from spreading opposing ideas. We have to do this or else they will destroy us. And so he was correct, I think, in his own way, but they splintered. Half of the communists said, that's not what we were promised. We were promised a worldwide revolution that would go on until the job was done. And so they wanted to follow a man named Trotsky, and you might know his name. He was famously executed by agents of Stalin. And so again, the other faction followed Stalin. And so they believed that the country, as it were, of the USSR would be enough for the time being, and they could work through that form. Caught up in this dispute between individuals who wanted a worldwide revolution that they thought they were promised and individuals who wanted to continue working through the country that they had understood is Walter Kavinsky. Walter Kavinsky defected after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that we discussed earlier. And again, that's not really important. Why? What is important is that he thought he was safe. He was living in America. He thought that he had gotten out of this war between the different communist parties, and he was executed. He was shot in the back of the head in a hotel room. And he was a friend of Whittaker Chambers's. So at that time, Whittaker Chambers realized, my friends are in danger. They are disappearing. They are being killed. And now I think I need to leave if I'm going to protect my family. So his motivation for leaving was at first philosophical. We'll get to that. But why he fled the city he was living in, why he assumed a new name and begun his job at Time magazine was an attempt to hide himself from these communists because he thought that he might be killed for his beliefs. Next, I want to look at the idea of politics as a religion, the idea that these individuals who have rejected religion, if you're familiar with the communist belief, or we could even say the communist faith, they believe that all religion is, as Marx said, opiate of the masses, the idea that you are distracting individuals from, as we said, this great revolution by having them attend church. You're having them believe in something else that's not the great class revolution and the great battle between the classes. It's something else that's a distraction. So they can't have any of that. But then they dedicate themselves so entirely to a belief system that closely mirrors a religion. We'll get into the actual text of Witness here for just a second. We'll get into the motivations of the communist, and we'll get into the quote at the beginning there. You'll realize that is a quote from the book of Genesis, of course, how the snake tempts Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is by telling them that you will be as God is. And we'll get into why I use that quote in just a minute. But at first, I do want to read from Witness. This is page 149. So at this time, Whittaker Chambers is speaking about why he wants to be a communist. At this point in his life, his brother has committed suicide. He is incredibly sad about that. He is incredibly moved by that. He believes that his brother was so sad and despondent about the state of the world that he couldn't live that way anymore. And so Whittaker Chambers is reacting to that and has this to say. He says, the dying world, which in the death throe of the First World War had just destroyed 11 million lives and was visibly preparing to destroy as many more in its next convulsion. Again, World War II had not yet happened at this time, whenever he was thinking. Which poisons it also killed my brother, inspired in me only a passing mood to flinch it, meaning he doesn't want to turn away. He doesn't hate the world in the same way that his brother did. Much more, it stirred a grimness in me, a will to end it, not so that kindness and compassion might reign on earth. We are not children. And he means by this, I don't want to make a paradise on earth, but that the possibility of kindness and compassion might survive it all, that human life might survive the death that fed on it. So his motivation to join the Communist Party, and he says that he became a communist on the next page because of that train of thought, is that he thought that all goodness and all possibility of happiness and all possibility of human survival as a fact, was tied up in this political system. He thought that there were two paths, destruction or communism. And again, that looks almost like a religious argument, the idea that the world is going to be given over to complete destruction. The world is going to be torn asunder if we do not do this. Now, again, let's pause. Let's jump from 1950 to 2020. Do people make the same sort of argument today? I think they do. People say that if we do not do this exact thing, if we do not raise taxes by this much, cut taxes by this much, the country is over. If we do not cut our emissions by so much, then the seas will swallow us up and the skies will darken and we will all die. And again, regardless of whatever you believe about individual political ideas, the idea that that hyperbole really touches some people. People almost want to believe that we are on the precipice of something awful happening every single day. And now that is where Whittaker Chambers was coming from. He believed that we were just about to destroy the whole world. And again, World War II is awful. We concluded World War II with the absolute destruction of two cities in Japan. And ultimately, even though that destruction was terrible, we might have actually prevented an even worse slaughter were we to invade Japan. Not all that to say that things were terrible in the 1930s and 1940s, but did the world become destroyed? Is the world irredeemable after that? No, all of us are still alive today. We're all doing our best. We're all living together. So it is a odd sort of self-centeredness that makes a person believe that the world is going to end within their lifetime. That's almost a religious impulse. And we'll have time to dive into that in just a little bit. I have the picture here of Prometheus, the idea that we also brought up last week in our Gnosticism class here for the Wednesday night class. And the idea of both a Nietzschean individual, if you're not familiar with Friedrich Nietzsche, his argument was that the individual needed to be so empowered as to control the whole world around them, or else their life would quickly become worthless. And then again, from the myth of Prometheus, the idea of the individual who is sacrificing all pieties and all niceties in order to bring fire to the world. And so the idea that you have to bring fire to others. What does that mean and what does that look like? Do individuals believe that their way of living is the only way of living? And we can see sort of some of this in the culture war today, I think, in the United States. Do people who live in LA and New York, would they ever think about honoring and enjoying the life of someone who lives in rural Iowa? Would they even consider that person to be from the same country that they are? Do they enjoy each other's company? Are they friends? Could they ever be friends? Those are some of the questions that I want to get into maybe a little bit later, but again, just something to keep in mind. Back in Whittaker Chambers' time, what does that look like for individuals caught up in the Cold War? In 1950s America, how could you have empathy for an individual halfway across the country living under a Soviet, an individual who can't even own their own house versus us here in America? So how can we transcend that? How can we get through it? How can we make something better, hopefully, in the church, and hopefully have our religious beliefs transcend over that? Next quote I have is by G.K. Chesterton, who's an author, and I really enjoy this. A dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. Again, no matter what we believe, there is a culture in the world. They have their own beliefs. And if we want to go with the flow, if we want to just simply drift with the tide, even a dead fish can drift with the tide. But if we want to go against it, if we want to go upstream and have our own beliefs, then we really have to be active in the world today. So how does that look? We'll get into that in just a little bit as well. I've called this next section the Forever War. Whittaker Chambers believes very much that the conflict between left and right politically, and specifically in his lifetime, between the communist and the free world is never ending. That if you step off the gas even a little bit for a second, that the other side will gain ground. Now, this sounds very destructive and very stressful. And this is why a lot of people, I think, don't want to become involved in politics. Whittaker Chambers has a very fun quote at the beginning of his novel when he's apologizing for staying too long at a friend's house. And he says, "I am a heavy man." And he doesn't mean by that he is portly, even though he kind of is. What he means is that he only feels that he is able to touch on these weighty topics, these sometimes depressing topics, and he is only able to make things philosophical. He's not able to make small talk without delving into topics like this. So what does that take from us if we are always and actively opposed to a world around us, if we are trying to swim upstream and we are trying to oppose the culture of the world? There's another quote that I want to get into from Chambers, and this will touch on the quote from Genesis that we mentioned just a second ago. This is from the preface of the novel, which is phrased as a letter from Chambers to his children, as sort of a model, it's not actually a letter to his children. So he is explaining here communism, and he is saying that, people in my time are saying that communism is a new faith. And he's saying it is not new. It is, in fact, man's second oldest faith. Its promise was whispered in the first days of the creation under the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, ye shall be as gods. It is the great alternative faith of mankind. Like all great faiths, its force derives from a simple vision. Other ages have had great visions. They have always been different versions of the same vision, the vision of God and man's relationship to God. The communist vision is the vision of man without God. Now, it's really easy to maybe even reject Chambers because that argument is infused throughout the entire book. It is his life, but we have to get beyond that. Take the word communism out. Even if we don't interact with communists and the communist world in the same way that Chambers did, which again, it's still definitely a world ideology. Let's look at what he's saying. He's saying that we are trying to interact with God here in the Christian world. We are trying to determine what God is, who God is, and how we can follow him in the most appropriate way. And again, in the Churches of Christ, we find that in the New Testament scriptures, and we try to live that way each day. But here we have individuals who are trying to live forcibly without God. And he's saying that is, again, not new. That goes all the way back to Genesis. Whenever you leave the garden, you leave the protection of God, trying to do so willingly because you're saying, I think I can do better. So with our political approach, what does this look like? Chambers notably broke with William F. Buckley, as it broke, was no longer able to, in good faith, work at National Review because he said, your magazine, National Review, is a famous conservative magazine. They still publish quite a bit today. But he had to leave because he said, you are too much a conservative. You're trying to conserve what you think are good ideals. And he said, I am a counter-revolutionary. This is Whittaker Chambers' words. I'm a counter-revolutionary. You are only seeking to conserve. I am trying to seek and destroy. I'm going after these ideas, and I'm trying to help the world get to a place where they don't exist anymore. So he is much more aggressive. Now, aggressive politics is something that's come up quite a bit in our culture and in our country. People say, I have to own the other side. I have to embarrass them. They can't be allowed to share their ideals in the public sphere even. You can get kicked off of Twitter for saying something wrong. You can get kicked off of anything for saying much of anything these days. So how does that look like maybe in a productive sense? How are we able to be counter-revolutionary and be constructive, or can we be? Or is this all too much? Are we asking ourselves to go too far outside the scope of the church if we follow in the path that Chambers has here? I have here the image of the death of Beowulf, which I apologize for spoiling the end of Beowulf for anyone who hasn't yet read it, but it's been out for 1,600 years, and so you've had plenty of time. Whenever Beowulf has his final battle with the dragon, he wins and he slays it, but he ends up being poisoned by the dragon's bite. And so he sits down and he looks at the treasure, the pile of gold that every dragon kind of has, I guess, for whatever reason, dragons have gold. He looks at the treasure that should have been his, but he realizes he's been poisoned. He sits down and he dies. Why do I bring that up? That's an image that's been sticking with me for a really long time now, because whenever I think about the Cold War and I think about this sort of lifestyle that Chambers is talking about, the idea of wanting to live without God, I don't think that that is simply constrained to the communist world anymore. I see that all over media. I see that all over what our young people believe and say. I see that in all of us in our own way. And again, that's a temptation. It's not unique, again, to communism or to any political ideology, but it is a belief that is very scary. And so with the death of Beowulf, again, I just say, have we been infected? Have we already been poisoned by the Cold War? Has the damage already been done? And we are simply sitting down looking at what could have been, and it's too late. I hope not. I really do hope not. So let's take a look at then how we can be positive and how we can maybe help to revitalize our country a little bit. That is the argument that we'll try and close with tonight. The idea of culture Kampf, this is a German word that means culture struggle. And so many of us are much more familiar with it as to say the culture war is very common to say in American culture these days. The idea that there is a left and a right, and they both want to live very different lives, and these lives are at their end unreconcilable. So again, very much again mirroring the East-West divide between the Free West and the Soviet East. In Chambers' own time, how can we square that circle? And how can we still be friendly, loving, approachable individuals if we are dedicated to this culture Kampf? or should we be? Is there a way around that? So whenever we get into our discussion tonight, I do hope we can touch on that just a little bit. Again, we are called to love the world and to love our neighbors, not love the world and that the worldly things, but everyone in the world is a son and daughter of God. The evil individuals that we bring up as a part of the totalitarian movements and the evil things that they did, those people are still sons and daughters of God. Not that we should be their friends and enable them, but we cannot simply hate people in the same way that people are tempted to today. We're going to take a break from Whittaker Chambers for just a second to go over a much smaller book. And I brought this because it is much more accessible. If you can see, it is much smaller, clocking in at maybe 300, 350 pages, much smaller than Witness. It's called Darkness at Noon. And this one is perhaps even more widely read than Witness because it is more widely appealing. I think it is much less just about the communist system, even though it takes place almost entirely there. I'll give you a brief overview. It is written by a man named Arthur Koestler, and I will just give you his picture there. Arthur Koestler, unlike Whittaker Chambers, I believe, is not so much a good man, but he is an equally talented writer, very skilled, and his book takes the form of sort of an allegory. It closely mirrors the Soviet purges. And so we touched on those just a little bit ago, but during the system and during the purges, any Soviets who held the wrong beliefs, and so again, we talked about the beliefs that Stalin had and his companions had, and then those on the other side of the Soviet system, they were imprisoned, they were made to testify against themselves on trumped up charges, and many of them were either imprisoned for long periods of time or were executed. Darkness at Noon is about one of these individuals who is an old Soviet war horse. He is an old Soviet politician, but he is caught up in these show trials. Now, it is in an allegorical and closely related world that is not really named. So they never call the country Russia. It's just called the country, and they never name Stalin. He's just called number one, and they never name anywhere that would make it just tied to one place and one time. But again, very closely, it mirrors the actions of the late 1930s Soviet show trials. So why is this important? There are three principal characters in Darkness at Noon. There's Rubashov. Rubashov, again, is the old Soviet. He was part of the founding generation of this story's Soviet system. There is Ivanov, and Ivanov is one of his friends who unfortunately has to arrest Rubashov because he is no longer, again, in the good graces of the system. And then very importantly, there's a man named Gletkin. And Gletkin shows one of the other argument threads that I want to pull out of these books. Gletkin is a much younger man. He has only known the Soviet system and he has grown up in it entirely. And from the point of view of the other two characters, he is completely damaged by this fact. He is a very different person. He's almost a different species of man. The logic and the philosophy that the other two men shared, because they had lived in an earlier time and they were just different individuals altogether, is not shared by Gletkin. He only knows the Soviet system and it makes him much more dangerous. Now, this novel, I will say again, is more accessible. If you want to get the sense of what animated these men and what made them tick, this is perhaps a closer look. It is, however, a more depressing book. It is just a sad novel about something that is happening to these characters. And again, so just steel yourself if you do decide to read it. Again,
really exciting.
Oh yes, yeah, it is.
Thanks for recommending it.
Yes, it is an exciting book, and I've recommended that to my friends. Again, not something that we should be is so much so depressing that it cannot be read and enjoyed, examined, I should say, but something that definitely has a very harsh lesson for the world. Arthur Koestler, again, is a different man from Whittaker Chambers. He was a Soviet and was a member of the party, but ultimately is not a good man. During his life, he sold out one of his mistresses and had her imprisoned and ultimately executed for crimes for his disparagement of the Soviet system. And ultimately, he would, at the end of his life, convince his wife to commit suicide with him. He was suffering from Parkinson's and chose not to live. So again, I do not endorse this man. I don't like this man to the extent I can like a man who's already been dead, but he is someone who I think is a talented writer in this instance and could be examined in this instance. Again, not someone that I want to take a look at. I want to go back for a second. The Pieta, the image of Mary holding the dead Christ, is powerful to us, so much so. And part of what makes Darkness at Noon interesting to me is that its characters also examine the Pietà. And what we see is the difference again between Rubashov, the man who is doubting and who thinks that there can be more, and Gletkin, again, the individual who believes in nothing anymore. And Rubashov still reacts to this and doesn't even know why, but he reacts to it. Gletkin does not. And that's what worries me so much with this story. Again, we're looking at the younger generations. Have they come unmoored? Is that poison already in their veins? Do they react to the story of Christ? Do they love Christ? Do they have that capacity in the same way? So again, not a question we can answer tonight, and not a question we can answer quickly, but something worth thinking about. Two quotes here that get into how the individual relates to both stories. The first of which, Darkness at Noon. This is Rubashov speaking. He is explaining why he is no longer in cooperation with the Soviet system. He says, the fact is, I no longer believe in my own infallibility. That is why I am lost. I also want to pull another quote from the book that I didn't have room to squeeze in. We'll get to that in just a second. We'll return to Darkness at Noon, but let's jump over to Witness. Let's look at how the individual also plays in here. This is Whittaker Chambers recounting an individual that he hadn't met, but that he knew of. This man was a Soviet attaché in Berlin. And in his life, he also broke with communism, and it happened because of the events of a single night. And his daughter, who again was a younger individual, only grew up in the Soviet system, explained it and said that my father left the Soviet system because one night he heard screams. He heard a woman scream in the night and he couldn't take it anymore and he had to leave. And she thought, my father is being ridiculous. And her father, again, this individual, thought, I cannot bear this anymore if people are going to be suffering. So again, Chambers kind of summarizes that. A child of reason in the 20th century, she knew that there is logic of the mind. She did not know that the soul has a logic that may be more compelling than the mind. So again, you see the younger generation maybe has lost something to connect with their soul. Something is different in these people, is what he's saying. She did not know at all that the logic had swept away the logic that she had swept away, at the logic of the mind, the logic of history, the logic of politics, the myth of the 20th century, with 5 annihilating words. One night he heard screams. So again, the idea that at the end of the day, the compassion that this man felt for another individual who might not have even been being persecuted, he just heard screams. And he said, all my doubts pile up and I'm projecting onto this one person. And if this system brings misery, I can't do it anymore. We'll return to Darkness at Noon for just a second, and there's a passage I wanted to read. This is when Rubashov is being interrogated. So again, this is the individual who is no longer in good graces of the Soviet system, and his old friend is interrogating him. And he says, listen, Rubashov, he said finally, him being Ivanov, again, the individual who is still part of the system. There is one thing I would like to point out to you. You have now repeatedly said you, meaning state and party, as opposed to I, that is Nicholas Simonovich Rubashov, so his own name. For the public, one needs, of course, a trial and legal justification. For us, what I have just said should be enough. So what he means is that even saying you and I in the Soviet system is a crime. There is no longer a you, there is no longer an I. There is the party, there is the state, there is the system, and there are the beliefs that we hold. So again, let's contrast that with the church and what we believe. We, of course, are sacrificing ourselves in the way that who we could have been, who we would have been, is no longer who we want to be. We abandon it and we pursue Christ. Okay, very good. These individuals are abandoning themselves and completely annihilating themselves for a political system. Do people still do this today? What does that look like? And I think young people frequently get caught up in things. A movie, a band, dressing a certain way. They get caught up in certain things. How dangerous is it whenever they get caught up in politics and it's just a part of their fashion? So we can deal with that in just a little bit as well. And I think that'll lead into some of our discussion questions as well. Our final answer here is our, hopefully, antithesis to these worldly views. These individuals are motivated by, again, worldly structures. How are we different? So we need to serve Christ. We need to serve the church. We cannot be overtly political in the way that these individuals are, where they are giving everything up to form a political ideology. I would say that if you want to be a practicing communist, you're going to have problems because they're asking you to not have any faith and to sacrifice yourself entirely to the state. I don't think we can do that. So let's look at how there is maybe a productive middle ground. how can we be politically active without trading away bits of ourselves that we are not comfortable with trading away? In America, it's a lot easier. We have the First Amendment. The First Amendment says that we cannot be forced to partake of certain religions, and we cannot have our religions regulated away from us, which again, we're very grateful for. But in other parts of the world, that's not the case. There are still state churches. There are still places where no church is allowed. And again, even if you are allowed to practice what you can actually say from the pulpit or in your classes or to sit on the street is tightly regulated. So how would that change how we live? And finally, what I want to look at is that our duty to Christ and the church is who we are. It's the only thing that we really have and that we can't be. So again, my argument tonight is that there are political means with which we can affect the world around us. There are means by which politics can have and will change the world, but ultimately there's also a way that we do it simply by following Christ. And if let's read together Ecclesiastes 12, 13 and 14. Whenever we dwell on politics and whenever you get caught up in things that are so much larger than it feels like yourself, I love these verses. This is the closing verses of the book of Ecclesiastes, and it summarizes who we not only can be, but altogether have to be. It reads, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." So again, there is something that goes beyond these vast systems. These create the world around us, the world with which we engage with every day. And that's why I think they're so important. I don't think you can run away. Just like the cannonball that was embedded in the Gettysburg House, just like the individuals that we've seen on the news with Afghanistan, the individuals we see on the news all the time. People all around the world are having their lives dictated by these political views. Maybe not these specifically that we talked about tonight, but politics is one of the means by which you create the world around us. I think it deserves examining, but ultimately our worth is with Christ and with the church. We have to examine what's truly important first. And this is something that, even though we do give it a place of importance, maybe in being good citizens and being educated people and being people who want to pursue worthwhile things, our place is always with Christ first and foremost. I have a number of discussion questions here, just two, but fairly large ones that I'd like to talk through, and then I'm not sure if we'll just pause this, pause the video sharing and then proceed. We can go on. Okay, sure. So there are two discussion questions that I want to get into for just a second. The first of which, what do we as Christians desire to transmit to our children? So first of all, what does that mean as a conservative? You are a conservative individual, you're seeking to conserve something. Darkness at Noon very pointedly brings that up. Again, the character of Gletkin showing the younger individuals who are in their way separated from the transcendent, separated from understanding and compassion with other people, and separated from the soul. Not that our children are necessarily there, but do we feel that maybe people who are growing up today are missing something? And how do we rectify that? Secondly, what does that look like? When you educate an individual, are you trying to get them to mirror your beliefs entirely? Is it you become just another version of me, or I have failed? What does that look like? And then, why or why not? If we're going to say that, and if we're going to back that up, I think we need to have some reasons for why we believe that. So what is education? What is the act of civilizing someone? An infant does not really have any higher beliefs. We need to be more than that if we're going to truly act on what we believe. Secondly, a number of Christians have decided against any political involvement. David Lipscomb in the Churches of Christ very famously, but others, of course, saying that any politics, you're trading away aspects of yourself and you're giving the political world leverage over you. I can't have any part of it. I think if you want to make that argument and live that way, perhaps, but I obviously come down somewhere a little bit different. So let's take a look at why we come down where we do. And this is an individual question. Everyone has different aspects of what they're comfortable with. Everyone has different strengths. And if this is going to be something, I think, where you are incapable of being able to still have compassion and love for your neighbor, if you're going to become involved in politics, maybe it's not for you. Maybe it's not something you should be involved in. But if you think you can do some good, maybe it's something you should look at. And so what does that look like? Again, I think that what Chambers and Kossedler are looking at goes beyond a sign in the front yard and a bumper sticker. It looks like a lifestyle. It looks like every interaction. Our lives are just a series of small interactions every day that build up to something so much larger. So what does that look like? And so using both narrow and broad definitions of politics, let's use narrow to say politics, again, just as an action. I pull the lever for this individual and I pull the lever against this levy, and there we go, politics. And broad, meaning that series of interactions, meaning more so the individual philosophy of each of us. How can we either make our decision to utilize or circumvent political action to further the work of the church? So again, you can opt in and out of politics and still remain whole. Again, depending on where you come down, that might be your decision one way or the other, but you cannot opt out of the work of the church. So if you're going to engage with this real world and with how people work in the world, how are you going to still be an effective Christian? So I think very much so questions that we could look at.